Hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar. And what that basically means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and have been doing so for decades at this point in my life. I've been a Tolkien fan since the 1980s and have been studying him nearly as long. Not quite as long since I was a boy in the 80s, but nearly as long. And I'm generally speaking the guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion or any of its satellite works or his translations or just Tolkien in general. And of course, if you want to ask a question, you can go right into the comment section and ask one right there, and I will answer it, of course. But if you want to be featured in a video, you'll want to go to a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask a question and have it answered by people with relevant experience in whatever field you're asking about. And so if you go on there and you ask a question, say about Gandalf or about Sauron or the elfish languages or anything to do with Tolkien, once you ask it, you're going to get a list of people that you can tag to answer the question, and my name will be at or near the top of that list, and you could ask me that way. Of course, there's also a link right in the description to my Quora account. You may find it easier to do it that way, as well as my space on Quora, which is called the Grey Havens, which has not only an archive of my answers, but as well other people's as well, that I have great respect for. So anyway, quick channel update. Hooray! We hit 2,000 subscribers. I'm just really, really happy about it. I was trying to be all solemn in my intro there. We got to talk about the fact that we reached 2,000 subscribers. We're actually at... Oh, I'm on the wrong account here. Let me switch over. We're actually... Last time I looked, it was like 2017, something like that. Let me switch over. We're at 2024 right now. Wow, that's last year. That's last year. So there we go. We're at 2024 subscribers. So some changes are going to happen. One thing is that I'm going to give myself a green screen, and I wanted to have it for this video, but some other expenses came up. There were some other things that are related to YouTube and Twitch and streaming and stuff that I had to take care of. So that sort of took precedence. But pretty soon I'm going to have a green screen, and I'll be able to be sitting, by the fire at the sitting room in Rivendell, or perhaps at the Prancing Pony, or maybe in Bag End, or Minas Tirith, or wherever. We'll have some cool backgrounds and stuff that we could use. Another thing is that I'm going to start streaming on YouTube. Now, I do stream on Twitch. As a matter of fact, I stream every day on Twitch, although they're usually video game streams. Although twice monthly, I do Tolkien streams, and a lot of those get uploaded here, like the Council of Tolkien and my reading streams. And we're going to start simultaneously streaming to Twitch and YouTube at the same time, so you'll see me go live on here as well. And those of you who are members will be able to make good use of your emotes and chat and such. The next Tolkien stream is actually 2 days from when I'm recording this, so it's already happened by the time most of you see this, and that one is going to be just on Twitch as per the normal, because 2,000 came quickly, and I didn't have time to set up not only the software for streaming simultaneously, but also I need to have moderation, so I'm going to have to pull a few people from my Twitch account to see if they'd be willing to moderate on YouTube as well. So there is that as well. But starting in February, we're going to be doing streams here on YouTube, so it's going to be really exciting. The Council of Tolkien, for example, and my next reading stream after, which we'll still be doing the Fellowship of the Ring at that point. And we're going to do a reading, of course, and I am actually going to be reading the Fellowship of the Ring, not just because it's relevant that I'm going to be reading it to you guys and doing analyses and such in 2 days, but also because this is somewhat relevant to one of the questions, the first question I'm going to handle as well. So I wanted to read a little bit of the chapter, The Shadow of the Past, and this is right after the scene where Gandalf had Frodo hand him the ring, and he tossed it into the hearth at Bag End, the fire, and it lit up, and he was able to positively identify that the ring that Frodo carried, that previously Bilbo had carried, and previously Gollum had carried, was indeed the One Ring, which he had suspected for some time, but now he has 100% positively identified, and that he has just revealed to Frodo that with the help of Aragorn, he had successfully captured Gollum and interrogated him, and he has told the story of how Gollum came to find the ring. And now we're going to get Frodo's sort of reaction to this, and Gandalf's speech on patience and pity and mercy, which of course flows into our first answer. "Gollum!" cried Frodo. "Gollum! Do you mean that this is the very Gollum creature that Bilbo met? How loathsome!" "I think it is a sad story," said the wizard. "And it might have happened to others, even to some hobbits that I have known." "I can't believe that Gollum was connected with hobbits, however distantly," said Frodo with some heat. "What an abominable notion!" "It is true all the same," replied Gandalf. "About their origins, at any rate, I know more than hobbits do themselves. And even Bilbo's story suggests the kinship. There was a great deal in the background of their minds and memories that was very similar. They understood one another remarkably well. Very much better than a hobbit would understand, say, a dwarf or an orc or even an elf. Think of the riddles they both knew, for one thing." "Yes," said Frodo, "though other folk besides hobbits ask riddles, and of much the same sort, and hobbits don't cheat. Gollum meant to cheat all the time. He was just trying to put poor Bilbo off his guard, and I dare say it amused his wickedness to start a game which might end in providing him with an easy victim. But if he lost, he would not hurt him." "Only too true, I fear," said Gandalf. "But there was something else in it, I think, which you don't see yet. Even Gollum was not wholly ruined. He had proved tougher than either the wise would have guessed, as a hobbit might. There was a little corner of his mind that was still his own, and light came through it, as though a chink in the dark, light out of the past. It was actually pleasant, I think, to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memories of wind and trees and sun on the grass and such forgotten things. But that, of course, would only make the evil part of him angrier in the end, unless it could be conquered, unless it could be cured." Gandalf sighed. "Alas, there is little hope of that for him. Yet not no hope. No, not though he possessed the ring so long, almost as far back as he can remember. For it was long since he had worn it much. In the black darkness it was seldom needed. Certainly he had never faded. He is thin and tough still. But the thing eating up his mind, of course, and the torment, had become almost unbearable. All the great secrets under the mountain had turned out to be just empty night. There was nothing more to find out, nothing worth doing, only nasty, furtive eating and resentful remembering. He was altogether wretched. He hated the dark, and he hated light more, and he hated everything, and the ring most of all." "What do you mean?" said Frodo. "Surely the ring was his precious and the only thing he cared for. But if he hated it, why didn't he get rid of it, or go away and leave it?" "You ought to begin to understand, Frodo." "After all you've heard," said Gandalf. "He hated it and loved it, as he hated and loved himself. He could not get rid of it. He had no will left in the matter. A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most he plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care, and that is only in an early stage, when it first begins to grip. But as far as I know, Bilbo alone in history has ever gone beyond playing, and really done it. He needed all my help, too, and even so, he would never have just forsaken it or cast it aside. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decided things. The ring left him." "Why, just in time to meet Bilbo," said Frodo. "Wouldn't an orc have suited it better?" "It is no laughing matter," said Gandalf, "not for you. It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far, Bilbo's arrival just at that time, and putting his hand on it blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. But when a chance came, it caught poor Deagle, and he was murdered, and after that Gollum, and it had devoured him. It could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean, and as long as it stayed with him, he would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when its master was awake once more and sending out his dark thought for Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ring-maker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker. In which case, you were also meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought. "It is not," said Frodo, "though I am not sure that I understand you. But how have you learned all this about the ring and about Gollum? Do you really know it all, or are you just guessing still?" Gandalf looked at Frodo, and his eyes glinted. "I know much, and I have learned much," he answered. "But I am not going to give an account of all my doings to you. The history of Elendil and Isildur and the One Ring is known to all the wise. Your ring is shown to be that One Ring by the fire writing alone, apart from any other evidence." "And when did you discover that?" asked Frodo, interrupting. "Just now in this room, of course," answered the wizard sharply. "But I expected to find it. I have come back from dark journeys and long search to make that final test. It is the last proof, and all is now only too clear. Making out Gollum's part and fitting it into the gap in history required some thought. I may have started with guesses about Gollum, but I am not guessing now. I know. I have seen him." "You have seen Gollum?" exclaimed Frodo in amazement. "Yes, the obvious thing to do, of course, if one could. I tried long ago, but I have managed it at last." "Then what happened after Bilbo escaped from him? Do you know that?" "Not so clearly. What I have told you is what Gollum was willing to tell, though not, of course, in the way I have reported it. Gollum is a liar, and you have to sift his words. For instance, he called the ring his birthday present, and he stuck to that. He said it came from his grandmother, who has lots of beautiful things of that kind, a ridiculous story. I have no doubt that Smeagol's grandmother was a matriarch, a great person in her way, but to talk of her possessing many elven rings was absurd. And as for giving them away, it was a lie, but a lie with a grain of truth. The murder of Deagol haunted Gollum, and he had made up a defense, repeating it to his precious over and over again as he gnawed bones in the dark, until he almost believed it. It was his birthday. Deagol ought to have given the ring to him. It had obviously turned up just so, as to be a present. It was his birthday present, and so on and on. I endured him as long as I could, but the truth was desperately important. And in the end I had to be harsh. I put the fear of fire on him, and wrung the true story out of him bit by bit, together with much snivelling and snarling. He thought he was misunderstood and ill-used. But when he had last told me his history, as far as the end of the riddle game and Bilbo's escape, he would not say any more except in dark hints. Some other fear was on him, greater than mine. He muttered that he was going to get his own back. People would see if he would stand being kicked and driven into a hole and then robbed. Gollum had good friends now, good friends and very strong. They would help him. Baggins would pay for it. That was his chief thought. He hated Bilbo and cursed his name. What is more, he knew where he came from. "But how did he find that out?" asked Frodo. "Well, as for the name, Bilbo very foolishly told Gollum himself. And after that it would not be too difficult to discover his country, once Gollum came out. Oh, yes, he came out. His longing for the ring proved stronger than his fear of the orcs, or even of the light. After a year or two he left the mountains. You see, though still bound by the desire of it, the ring was no longer devouring him. He began to revive a little. He felt old, terribly old, yet less timid, and he was mortally hungry. Light of sun and moon, he still feared and hated, and he always will, I think. But he was cunning. He found he could hide from daylight and moonshine, and make his way swiftly and softly by dead of night with his pale, cold eyes, and catch small, frightened or unwary things. He grew stronger and bolder with new food and new air. He found his way into Mirkwood, as one would expect." "Is that where you found him?" asked Frodo. "I saw him there," answered Gandalf. "But before that he had wandered far, following Bilbo's trail. It was difficult to learn anything from him for certain, for his talk was constantly interrupted by curses and threats. 'What has it got in its pockets?' he said. It wouldn't say, 'No, precious, little cheat, not a fair question. It cheated first, it did. It broke the rules. We ought to have squeezed it. Yes, precious, and we will, precious.' That is a sample of his talk. I don't suppose you want any more. I had weary days of it, but from hints dropped along the snarls, I gathered that his padding feet had taken him at last to Esgaroth, and even to the streets of Dale, listening secretly and peering. Well, the news of the great events went far and wide in Wilderland, and many had heard Bilbo's name and knew where he came from. We had made no secret of our return journey to his home in the west. Gollum's sharp ears would soon learn what he wanted. Then why wouldn't he track Bilbo further, asked Frodo. Why didn't he come to the Shire? Ah, said Gandalf. Now we come to it. I think Gollum tried to. He set out and came westward as far as the great river. But then he turned aside. He was not daunted by the distance, I am sure. No, something else drew him away. So my friends think, those that hunted him for me. The wood elves tracked him first, an easy task for them, for his trail was still fresh then. Through Mirkwood and back again it led them, though they never caught him. The wood was full of the rumour of him, dreadful tales even among beasts and birds. The woodman said there was some new terror abroad, a ghost that drank blood. It climbed trees to find nests. It crept into holes to find the young. It slipped through windows to find cradles. But at the western edge of Mirkwood the trail turned away. It wandered off southward and passed out of the wood elves' ken, and was lost. And then I made a great mistake. Yes, Frodo, and not the first, though I fear it may prove the worst. I let the matter be. I let him go, for I had much to think of at the time, and I still trusted the lore of Saruman. Well, that was years ago. I have paid for it since with many dark and dangerous days. The trail was long cold when I took it up again after Bilbo left here, and my search would again have been in vain, but for the help that I had from a friend, Aragorn, the greatest traveller and huntsman of this age in the world. Together we sought for Gollum down the whole length of Wilderland without hope and without success, but at last, when I had given up the chase and turned to other perils, Gollum was found. My friend returned out of the great perils, bringing the miserable creature with him. What he had been doing he would not say. He only wept and called us cruel, with many a Gollum in his throat. And when we pressed him, he whined and cringed and rubbed his long hands, licking his fingers as if they pained him, as if he remembered some old torture. But I'm afraid there is no possible doubt. He had made his slow, sneaking way, step by step, mile by mile, down south at last to the land of Mordor. A heavy silence fell in the room. Frodo could hear his heart beating. Even outside, everything seemed still. No sound of Sam's shears could now be heard. Yes, to Mordor, said Gandalf. Alas, Mordor draws all wicked things, and the dark power was bending all its will to gather them there. The ring of the enemy would leave its mark too, leave him open to the summons, and all folk were whispering then of the new shadow in the south, and its hatred of the west. There were his fine new friends who would help him in his revenge. Wretched fool! In that land he would learn much, too much for his comfort. And sooner or later, as he lurked and pried on the borders, he would be caught and taken for examination. That was the way of it, I fear. When he was found, he had already been there long, and was on his way back, on some errand of mischief. But that does not matter much now. His worst mischief was done. Yes, alas! Through him the enemy has learned that the One has been found again. He knows where Isildur fell. He knows where Gollum found his ring. He knows that it is a great ring, for it gave long life. He knows that it is not one of the three, for they have never been lost, and they endure no evil. He knows that it is not one of the 7 or the 9, for they are accounted for. He knows that it is the One, and he has heard at last, I think, of hobbits and the Shire. The Shire, he may be seeking for it now, if he has not already found out where it lies. Indeed, Frodo, I think he may even think that the long unnoticed name of Baggins has become important. But this is terrible, cried Frodo. Far worse than the worst that I imagined from your hints and warnings. O Gandalf, best of friends, what am I to do? For now I am really afraid. What am I to do? What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance. Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. I am sorry, said Frodo, but I am frightened, and I do not feel any pity for Gollum. You have not seen him, Gandalf broke in. No, and I don't want to, said Frodo. I can't understand you. Do you mean to say that you and the elves have let him live on after all those horrible deeds? Now, at any rate, he is as bad as an orc and just an enemy. He deserves death. Deserves it! I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or for ill, before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. In any case, we did not kill him, for he is very old and very wretched. The wood elves have him in prison, but they treat him with such kindness as they can find in their wise hearts. Okay. I went on a little longer than I had expected, but I wanted to definitely get to that part. So you'll understand why I wanted to read that a little bit more when we get to the first question, which has a lot to do with Gandalf and has a bit to do with this scene as well. But the important things are the way that Tolkien uses capitalization. He is very specific. When he capitalizes a word that is not normally capitalized, he is drawing specific importance to it. Like when Gandalf says a word of command when he speaks about using a door-closing spell against the Balrog to shut it away. And when he says that he uttered a word of command, it's a command with a capital C. It is a divine order coming from one of the Ainur, the angels, and that the counterspell not only was enough to be a counterspell, to even counter a word of command, but that the explosion nearly destroyed Gandalf, made him realize that he was up against something as great as he. His words in that scene where I have met my match and have nearly been destroyed. And when Legolas sees the Balrog, for Gandalf did not actually lay eyes on it at this point, he had only sensed that something was coming. And he said, "Oi, hi, a Balrog has come." Gandalf was like, I should have known, you know. He understood now that what he faced was indeed an equal, another one of the Ainur, of a fallen angel, but an angel nonetheless. Now, when Frodo speaks here, and he says the words, "What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance." The only words that in that sentence that are capitalized are what, because it's the first word of the sentence, and Bilbo, because it's a proper noun, a name. Now, Gandalf replies, "Pity." And of course, that's capitalized because it's the first word of the sentence. But then starting a new sentence, "It was pity that stayed his hand." It is, of course, capitalized because it's the first word of the sentence. But pity is now capitalized. And here Tolkien is differentiating between the pity as understood by Frodo and pity as understood by Gandalf. Pity and mercy. Mercy is capitalized again. And we see this again with pity capitalized. And we see it again later on with the word mercy. The one that doesn't come capitalized, but I feel should have been capitalized had Tolkien chosen to use the word, is patience. But we learn in the Silmarillion about young Gandalf, Olorin, and how he had learned the virtues of patience and pity and mercy from one of the Valar, of course, Nienna. Most of the Maiar, which is the type of angel that Gandalf is, will stick to one of the Valar. And they'll just learn from that one Valar. For example, Saruman learned from Aula. So did Sauron. But many of them will pick a Valar. But Gandalf is different. He learned from many of the Valar. He went to Varda. He went to Manwë. He went to Nienna. And of course, Irmo. But the one, it's mentioned specifically in the Silmarillion that he kept coming back to Nienna. And it was Nienna that taught him these lessons of patience, pity, and mercy. And here he is speaking of it. When Frodo speaks, he's like, it's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill that guy. And Gandalf says, but it was pity. That was the reason he didn't. And if we go back to The Hobbit, he did have an urge to stab Gollum, and I feel that this urge really didn't come from Bilbo at all. It came from the One Ring, and just like the One Ring urged Smeagol to kill Deagol, so in this chance where now the ring has passed hands to Bilbo, it is urging him to finish off Gollum. But he rejects this notion. He says it's not a fair fight. He's armed and invisible, whereas Gollum is neither. this is true pity, when it would have been easier to kill him. But he took the harder road in mercy here. And this is the true sort of divine pity and mercy that we see that Gandalf speaks of. The only other thing about this whole section that I wanted to talk about... Let's see... specifically about the ring itself here. And it was mentioned that the story that came from Gollum initially was that his grandmother gave him the ring, and Gandalf, of course, knows this is a lie. He rejects it, and he said no one would ever give away a great ring. Now, what's interesting here is that Gandalf is not being entirely truthful. It is true that no one would willingly give away the One Ring, and that Bilbo was the first person in history to ever willingly give away the One Ring, with great assistance from Gandalf. As a matter of fact, Gandalf described in the story The Quest for Erebor that assisting Bilbo in this fashion was the most difficult thing that he ever did in Middle-earth. And this is including the fact that he died. So he killed a Balrog, he battled it for 11 days, and then died of exhaustion afterwards. So he's saying that was obviously not a good thing, that was an ordeal, but what he went through with Bilbo was more difficult. And of course the second most difficult thing had to do with Thorin and Bilbo, convincing Thorin to take Bilbo with him on the quest for Erebor. But what's interesting, of course, Sam also later gives up the ring willingly, with only mild reluctance. Now, he did not have the ring for many years, like Frodo did, or like Bilbo did, or like Gollum did, or even Isildur had it for about 2 years. He only had it for what I believe is about a day or so, but he was in Mordor, so it kind of hits differently there. It was still very difficult. Really shows Sam's strength and Sam's character there. But Gandalf obfuscates the truth a lot with Frodo. He tells Frodo that Gollum was like a hobbit. He's akin to the fathers of the Stoors. Sort of a prototypical hobbit, You share a common ancestor maybe, but not quite a hobbit. But of course we know that Gollum was a hobbit. He was a Stoor. And he was not so old as to be some evolutionary ancestor. The Shire itself is quite a lot older than Gollum, and his people, not him specifically, but his people once lived in the Shire and moved away because they didn't find it to their liking. They regressed, they remigrated, is the word that Tolkien uses specifically in his letters. They remigrated and went back to a more primitive way of life, not a more primitive form. They didn't devolve in that sense, but they went back to the way that they had been previously, the way that they had lived their lives previously. And Gandalf knows this. He obfuscates the truth because he's trying to soften the blow. He doesn't really just want to come out and tell Frodo that Gollum was a hobbit. And this is understandable from his perspective. He's not exactly lying, but he's not telling the full truth. And here he is in the way of keeping his great secret of his own. He is not telling the full truth, almost a lie of omission, when he says that no one has ever given up a great ring. Now, specifically, a great ring is any of the rings of power, not one of the lesser rings. And, of course, Gandalf has one of these great rings, and he is currently wearing it. Of course, Frodo can't currently see it. But Gandalf is indeed wearing this ring. And what's interesting about this, there's two interesting things about this. One is that it was given to him quite willingly by the elf Círdan. And Círdan was not the only one to give up a ring, because Gil-galad had also done the same thing. Gil-galad gave... Oh, I am sorry about that. I had just rebooted and I forgot to turn off those system sounds. Let me just fix that real quick. There we go. That won't happen again. That scared me too. Gil-galad had given his ring to Elrond, and as a matter of fact, the 3 rings that wound up in the elvish hands were all given to their original bearers by Celebrimbor, who made them. So, like I said, I think that Gandalf is doing this sort of thing like when you learn something in school that seems very simple, and then you later learn that it's not quite a lie, but it's also not quite the truth. It's just more complicated. The truth is far more complicated. And it's sort of like going from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings to the Silmarillion and finding the truth is increasingly more complicated. So, like I said, Gandalf's not exactly lying here, but he's almost making a lie of omission. He's leaving out parts to make his point to Frodo and to help Frodo understand what's happening and to impress upon him the importance of leaving the Shire. The second interesting thing about specifically Gandalf's ring, Narya, is some people will say to me, so I bring this up a lot, that Galadriel specifically revealed her ring, Nenya, to Frodo, and that she held up her hand to the sky where the star of the Arundel glittered between her fingers and revealed her ring. And the way that I always saw this was that the ring just appeared. It was invisible, but became visible to Frodo's eye because Galadriel chose to reveal it to him. And she said that it is because he is the bearer of the One Ring. She turns to Sam and says, "Could you see my ring?" And he says, "No, I saw the star, but I did not see your ring." And some people will say, well, it's not that Galadriel specifically revealed it to Frodo, but that Frodo could see it because he was the bearer of the One, that she could not hide it from him. And some of the language does seem to support that, but I don't believe that is Tolkien's intent, because he never saw Gandalf's ring, and he never saw Elrond's ring, and he certainly spent enough time around Elrond, and he absolutely spent enough time around Frodo. And the thing is that, yes, it is true that the bearers of the three could not hide their rings from the Lord of the Rings. But Frodo is not the Lord of the Rings. Pippin makes the mistake of calling him that at one point, and Gandalf says, no, there is only one Lord of the Rings, and that is Sauron. Of course, Sauron can't detect these rings either because he doesn't have the ring currently. So my belief is that, yes, Galadriel would have been unable to hide her ring from Frodo if he had been wearing the One Ring, but of course he was not. But she did specifically reveal it to him, but not to Sam. And of course, Sam later saw all three of the Elven rings at the Grey Havens. They had lost their powers at that point because the one was destroyed. So anyway, we're going to move on to your questions. There was something else that I was going to bring up, and I don't remember what it is, so I guess it may not have been all that important. If I do remember it at some point during this, I'll bring it up in the outro. But we're going to move on to your question. We have 10 questions, and I had asked you guys if you had preferred less questions with more detailed responses or more questions with less detailed responses. And while some people said yes, do a mixture of both, as you have been doing, overwhelmingly you guys sort of agree with what I think is to do less questions but with more detailed responses, although I will leave it open to sometimes have shorter, more fun questions mixed in there if I think they're interesting enough. So here we go. Let's move on to your first question. Our first question comes in by the request of Ashikin Ammon, and I hope I'm saying that right, who asks, which The Lord of the Rings character do you admire the most and why? So I mentioned that the reading that I had done earlier was related to this first question, so you might guess that it's Gandalf, and it is. And I read that to sort of show off part of the reason why it's Gandalf. And the answer to this has changed over the years. It wasn't always Gandalf, but after decades of enjoying The Lord of the Rings and studying The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's legendarium as a whole, and the deeper understanding that I've developed over time with great study, the answer is absolutely Gandalf. It's easy to sum up Gandalf's personality by the way that he was eulogized in Lothlorien after his fall in Moria. However, the characters there only have the most limited understanding of Gandalf and his mission and even his personality. Even the elves, who have known him for a long time, some, since his arrival in Middle-earth, do not really know much about him. In the Silmarillion, he is called Olorin, saving for the final chapter, in which uses the name Mithrandir. And the Silmarillion doesn't actually draw a connection between Olorin and Mithrandir. You're expected to just draw that conclusion yourself. And he's not a very important character. The nature of Middle-earth mentions the guardians who protected the elves during the War of the Valar: Melian, Tarandor, Olorin, Hravendil, Palasendo, and Hymenar. The text notes that aside from Melian, the other 5 were the same as the later Istari, the wizards. Now note that all of those names are different except for one. The name Tarandor for Kuramo or Kuranir or Saruman, for example, only appears in the nature of Middle-earth. Nowhere else do you see the name Tarandor. It could be that the elves of the Great Journey came up with these names, and the more familiar analogues of Kuramo, Aloran, Iwendil, Alatar, and Palando were created later in the Undying Lands, and then, of course, in Middle-earth, they gained more names, the most familiar being Saruman, Gandalf, Radagast, Merenatar, and Ramostano. The point that I'm making is getting into all the names, without getting into the deeper idea of translating their meanings, is that across the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and the nature of Middle-earth and the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf's name is consistent. Faramir recounts to Frodo that Gandalf's, true name was Aloran, that it had been revealed to him. So where does this get into my admiration? Well, now, ignoring the other wizards, I will talk about what Gandalf's name means. Gandalf itself literally means wand elf, and Mithrandir is gray pilgrim. Tharkun is gray wand man. And while the less desirable name, Icanus, means northern spy, but his true name is Olorin, and it's not accurately translated by Tolkien. Olorin is related to the Quenya word Olor, which means dreams. While Tolkien never stated the exact transliteration or meaning of Olorin, I choose to interpret it as dreamer. Gandalf is one who operates on faith, almost to a fault, and this fact is recognized by elves of every era. Gandalf is a dreamer. He sees a world without Sauron and how wonderful it could be. And unlike his contemporary Saruman, he's not willing to become like Sauron to achieve that goal. He was sorely tempted to take the One Ring when offered, but he was strong enough to resist. One of the lines that stays with me in The Lord of the Rings was during one of Gandalf's discussions with Denethor, where Denethor was upset that the One Ring was not brought to him. And Gandalf states that he would have sent the ring to Denethor if he found him to be trustworthy, but he was not. And he then adds, before you get angry, I also think I myself am not trustworthy. Gandalf is a guy who can see his own flaws. He can acknowledge his flaws, and he works around his flaws, while also seeing the good in everybody that he could. He was an advocate of patience, even as he sometimes lost his patience. He was an advocate of pity and mercy. When Gandalf comes with Aragorn and Imrahil to the Black Gate, he tells the mouth of Sauron that he would accept a surrender from Sauron. And he was being truthful. If Sauron came out and surrendered, Gandalf would accept it, and he would accompany Sauron to Valinor. It was the patience, pity, and mercy that Olorin learned from one of his patron, Nienna, that he spoke of. There are many that deserve to die that live, and many that die that deserve life. Can you give it to him? That whole speech that I read earlier. Frodo didn't understand it at the time. To him, Gollum was a character in a book that Bilbo wrote. He knew Gollum was real, but he never imagined that he would meet the creature. And he wondered, why would Bilbo let this guy live? And in this argument, Frodo can't bring himself to pity Gollum. And Gandalf cuts him off by simply saying, you have not seen him. Later, Frodo says to Sam that he does pity Gollum because he has seen him, for I have seen him. Now, I could go on. Gandalf is, of course, not perfect. No one is within the circles of the world, and no one is more aware of this than Gandalf. Yes, he sometimes has a short temper, and sometimes his patience wears thin, especially if very young hobbits are making noises when he's trying to think, but he is still an idea to strive for in his approach of always favoring mercy. So there you go. And I just wanted to highlight one of the comments I got here from Andrew Banyai, who says, at some point, my Quora feed will simply retitle itself my John Sierra Explains the Lord of the Rings feed, and I'm totally okay with this. So I thank you very much for that. I know that if you interact with any sort of Tolkien content on Quora, you're just going to get flooded with my content, and that's just the way it is because I do write a lot on there, and obviously the algorithm there does favor me. So I'm glad you're enjoying it. That's all I wanted to say, and we're going to move on to the next question. Okay, so our next question comes in from Wynne Griffiths, who asks, how long would a hobbit take to walk 100 miles across the Shire? So this is actually impossible to answer. This is one of those sort of vague questions with too many variables to answer. So let me answer a question with a series of questions, 6 of them to be exact. Question the first, which hobbit are we talking about? Are they young or are they old? Are they used to walking long distances? Question the second, where within the Shire are they traveling? Are they using roads or are they traveling in a straight line across open country? Question the third, are they stopping at all? If so, how often are they stopping? And for what purpose are they stopping? Question the fourth, what's the weather like? Is it fair? Is it raining? Is it thundering, perhaps? Is there great wind? What's going on with the weather? Question the fifth, is this hobbit in a hurry? Do they have urgent business, or are they just strolling along leisurely? Will they stop and chat with people? And final question, are we talking about a stoor, a fallowhide, or a harfoot? The long-legged fallowhides likely travel faster than the tiny little harfoots. Feel free to get back to me on this, of course. Now, not a very long answer, but I did want to highlight the comments here, which is why I chose this. And one of them was from Wynne Griffiths, who wrote, the Shire is 40 by 50 leagues in area. On main road to Meikle Delving from Brandywine Bridge has 5 towns in the main road, unless you decide to go off track to Tookborough. Each town will have an inn, snacks, and ale, singing and sleeping. 2 or 3 towns in that distance, say at 4 miles per hour, a harfoot. So that answers some of the questions, but it doesn't really answer all of them. I mean, you could easily say, well, you could convert leagues to miles, which is not very difficult to do, 4 miles per hour, and you can come up with a number of hours, and then say, okay, well, they stopped here for a few hours, they stopped there for a few hours, but we don't know. Are they old? Are they young? Are they in a hurry? I mean, I guess saying 4 miles per hour, but I really don't see somebody traveling consistently at 4 miles per hour. That's a rather brisk pace for walking, especially for a harfoot. So we don't know about the weather, we don't know if they're stopping to chat with people along the way, not just to eat and such. So I really still think that it's a question that we can't answer. Maybe Matt would be into this sort of thing, but I think that, see, Matt would be funny because he would say the definitive answer is that, and of course not counting for variables, because that's sort of the way Matt's mind works, and it's wonderful in its own way. But I think that the interesting thing here that comes into it is the size of the Shire is really interesting. And Nick Smith here mentioned, I am also having trouble with the distances in The Lord of the Rings. We have a map on the wall, a poster of Middle-earth, and we have been tracking the journey as we read. It feels like the distance from Rivendell to Moria and from Lorien to Emyn Muil is a lot smaller than across Hobbiton, and especially across Rohan. And this is true. The Shire is quite big. It's quite big. It's open country. It has roads. It has pastures and such. The reason that these other jaunts take a long time is not necessarily because of the great distance. In going from Rivendell to Moria, first of all, they were using stealth. They were not using roads. They were going across wild, untamed country. And it was much the same in the Shire, because they didn't use the roads. They cut through the old forest. They got lost in the Barrow Downs. A lot of things happened along the way. Now, from Lorien to Emyn Muil, they went quickly because part of it was on a boat sailing down the river. And, of course, the Emyn Muil was the first sort of place, or one of the first places that Frodo and Sam wound up after leaving the company. Now, Rohan is interesting because in this case, the characters involved, Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, are sprinting. And then once they meet Éomer, they get horses. Now, they do lose their horses after this because of Saruman, but at this point, they're traveling with Gandalf then, and Shadowfax is involved. So, yes, it does seem that the going is very slow at first, but you have to understand that it's just 4 hobbits, and they're sort of going through country that they know, but taking an unfamiliar route and trying to stay off the road, stopping to chat with Farmer Maggot, stopping to chat with Gildor and Glorian, stopping to go through the old forest, getting quite lost in the old forest, spending a few days with Tom Bombadil. So, yeah. And then comparing it, like I said, from going down from Lorien to the Emyn Muil, that goes by very quickly because of a boat, And then we have Aragorn sprinting with Legolas and Gimli. So I hope that answers the follow-up question there as best as I can. But I really don't, I can't say, maybe you could say an average hobbit, and you could come up with the answer on your own at that point. But the point that I was making is that the question is sort of getting at this idea that they should take a certain time or they shouldn't take a certain time, and that when hobbits don't generally travel, and even within the Shire, it's sort of unusual for them to travel. And we see this, that the hobbits in Hobbiton think of the hobbits in Buckland as being weirdos. And then when we arrive in Buckland, and we talk to Farmer Maggot and his wife, who are good, decent people, but they think the people in Hobbiton are weirdos. And it used to be that hobbits would travel all over, and they would even travel outside the Shire. Now they don't even travel outside their own towns all that often, which is a shame, and of course would change later after the fall of Sauron. Let's get on to your next question. My next question comes in from Prosper Kelly, who asks, what is the Lord of the Rings lore and chronological order so far? Here it is. It's right here. I have it right here. It's in this book right here. It's called The Silmarillion. This is the entire chronological lore of Tolkien's Legendarium. The Silmarillion is often thought of as a prequel to The Lord of the Rings. And it doesn't actually say that on here, you might notice. Now, if I grab The Hobbit, I'm not sure that my copy would say it, but many copies of The Hobbit will say something like, it does say, no, that's the Two Towers. Where's The Hobbit? Is this The Hobbit? Here it is. See, it doesn't say anything on the cover other than The Hobbit, but many modern ones will say the enchanting prequel to The Lord of the Rings, or sometimes not prequel, but prelude, they'll say. But the Silmarillion is the one that's thought of as the prequel, and that's only partially true. The Lord of the Rings itself, as a story, is represented as the final chapter in the Silmarillion, which is called Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. It's just told in the very brief and undetailed chronology fashion that the rest of the book is in. The Silmarillion starts with a creation myth and ends with the fall of Sauron and the departure of the elves. To demonstrate such, I'm going to read to you the first paragraph of the Silmarillion, followed by the final paragraph of the Silmarillion. So here's the first paragraph. There was Eru the One, who in Arda is called Luvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the Holy Ones, that were the offspring of his thought. And they were with him before aught else was made, and he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. but for a long while they sang only each alone, or but a few together, while the rest hearkened, for each comprehended only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet even as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. And now here is the final paragraph of the Silmarillion. White was the ship, and long was it a building, and long it awaited the end which Círdan had spoken. But when all these things were done, and the heir of Isildur had taken up the lordship of men, and the dominion of the west had passed to him, then it was made plain that the powers of the three rings was also ended. And to the firstborn, the world grew old and grey. In that time the last of the Noldor set sail from the havens and left Middle-earth forever. And latest of all, the keepers of the three rowed to the sea, and Master Elrond took there the ship that Círdan had made ready. In the twilight of autumn it sailed out of Mithlond, until the seas of the bent world fell away beneath it, and the winds of the round sky troubled it no more, and bore upon the high airs above the mists of the world it passed into the ancient west, and an end was come for the Eldar of story and of song. So it starts with essentially, in the beginning God created the angels and they sang, and it ends with Sauron is defeated, the elves passed over the sea, leaving Middle-earth in the care of Aragorn. I really hope that you weren't expecting me to actually tell you the entire chronology. That would be insane. There are, of course, other books in the Legendarium. There's the Children of Húrin and the fall of Númenor, the fall of Gondolin, the one that I can't, Beren and Luthien. It's literally sitting right here. It's right over there, Beren and Luthien. But all of these are sort of spun off from the Silmarillion. The idea behind the Silmarillion was that it was the outline, and it would sort of briefly tell the chronology, and that there would be great tales that would be spun out of the Silmarillion, and some of them Tolkien wished to write in whole, like The Lord of the Rings, and some of them he would not write out in whole, but he would leave them for other people to finish. And of course, nobody's actually taken up. I mean, there were a few people who tried to finish The Fall of Gondolin, so there is that. But that was not official work. It was not released as a book. It was released on the internet. So they're all a part of a whole. And the Silmarillion itself is not even finished. That's the craziest part. We're going to talk about that a little while later. But yeah, there we have it. Now, Nick Smith left me a comment that I thought was rather funny. Points out that part of the question says so far, as if Tolkien's about to release another book. And the thing is, that might happen. Every time a new J.R.R. Tolkien book comes out, we think it's the last one. You know, The Children of Húrin came out in 2007. Tolkien died in 1973. And it's sort of like, okay, well, we can see where this was made up of content that was in Unfinished Tales and content that was in the Silmarillion and some stuff that was not released, and it was all edited together into a cohesive novel. And then Beren and Luthien comes out, whereas the story that we know of Beren and Luthien is in the Silmarillion. Here's a collection of a bunch of older versions of it. And then The Fall of Númenor comes out. The Fall of Gondolin came out, which gave different versions of that story, and The Fall of Númenor basically gave us all of the Númenor stories in one place, some of them from the Silmarillion, some of them from the Lost Road and other writings, some of them from various other sources like Unfinished Tales. So it was really more of a collection. But every time we think this is the last one, they're not going to come out with another one. And then a few years pass and another one comes out, so we never know. His estate has access to a lot of notes. Are they all published? I'm going to say no, they're not all published. Can some of them be collected into works or even made into novels? Perhaps. We'll find out. Or we won't. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Alexander, who asks, did Galadriel meet Gandalf when he was a Maiar in Valinor? Possibly, but it's unlikely that she would have known that she met him. First, let me address a few issues with the wording of the question, asking about when Gandalf was a Maiar is incorrect on two levels. The first is the word Maiar is actually plural. The singular is Maya. The other issue is that it suggests that Gandalf is no longer a Maya. While he is incarnated himself into a mortal body, this doesn't change his nature, it only masks his nature. Either way, let's get into the actual question at hand. In his youth, that's the way that he said it to Faramir, he was called Olorin. And as I alluded to earlier, the one mention of him in the Silmarillion that refers to him as such exists really only to point out that we don't know a lot about him. We learn more from books like Unfinished Tales and The Nature of Middle-earth, but the former relates mostly to his conversation with Manwë being chosen to be a wizard, and this was, of course, after Galadriel had departed, while the latter only mentions that he came to Middle-earth during the War of the Valar with a group of Maiar led by Melian to protect the elves before Galadriel was born. What the Silmarillion does tell us of a young Gandalf is that he was very shy. And when he walked among the elves, he was either unseen or disguised as an elf himself. He mostly gave them fair dreams and wisdom. His very name, Olorin, as I mentioned earlier, it's derived from the Quenya word for dreams, a name I personally interpret as meaning dreamer. So if Galadriel did encounter Olorin, she didn't know that she did. He either would have walked beside her invisibly and whispered fair thoughts and wisdom to her, or he would have appeared to be an elf man, and maybe they had a conversation, and she had no idea that that was the guy that she met later in Middle-earth, Gandalf. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Brad Dickerson, who asks, what is the day in the life of elves and dwarfs held in Mandos? What did Feanor and the Durins do to fill their time? Are they able to follow the trials and tribulations of Middle-earth? There is no indication that they do much of anything. We don't get much of a description of Mandos or the doings within, and this is by design, as the Silmarillion is a chronicle in-universe written by the elves. We have some inside knowledge of elves that have been to Mandos and returned, but this is a maybe. The Lord of the Rings is written from the perspective of the Hobbits, but supplemented by the accounts of the wise, which may possibly include Glorfindel, the one character in the Lord of the Rings that we can say with full certainty has been to Mandos. But of course, no description of Mandos is given in the Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit actually gives more insight into this than the Lord of the Rings. As Thorin Oakenshield, before his death, refers to Mandos as the halls of waiting and describes what he believes his experience will be. I'm going to read you that sentence there. I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship with you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate. Just the name that Thorin calls it tells us that he expects to wait. He also says that he will sit beside his father, suggesting a long rest until the end of the world, when the world will be renewed. We are told that Feanor communicated with his father and his mother in Mandos, and they communicated with each other as well, though they were not near each other, and that his mother communicated to his father across great distance with the exchange of thought. The only description we get of what Mandos looks like is that it is cavernous, and we are told that no being, not even Manwë, was able to depart Mandos without the express permission of Namo. It seems those who are there just wait. They don't have bodies, and they can't do much of anything. They wait for their sentence to be up, if it's the likes of Feanor or Morgoth. They wait for new bodies to be made for them, the likes of Glorfindel or Finrod. They wait for the end of the world, such as the dwarves, or they wait to depart the world, the mortal men that were slain before their time. Miriel was there voluntarily, and she could leave at any point, though due to her husband remarrying, she had to remain separate from them, as he could not have two wives alive in the world. and she did eventually depart Mandos, but she remained in Lorien. As for keeping up with the events, the trials and tribulations of Middle-earth, I would say that, tragedies happen, elves keep coming there, dwarves show up, and if they're in communication with each other, which it seems that they are, that they would get news from the elves and the dwarves that arrive. But also we have to keep in mind Namo, who is usually referred to in the Silmarillion as Mandos. It's explained that he's so associated with Mandos that the elves call him Mandos. Just like Urmo is so associated with the realm of Lorien that they call him Lorien. But his real name is Namo, and he has a wife. Her name is Vaira. Vaira is the Valar that is the one that writes. She's the scribe. She's the one that writes everything down, or I should say weaves tapestries of the history of the world. So I would say that Namo himself would be quite well versed in the goings on in Middle-earth and the world in general, because his wife is the one that's in charge of keeping an accounting of all this. So if they really need to know what's happening, they could ask Namo and just really hope that he's in the mood to actually speak to them. I think with Feanor, he might just look at him like, but with some of them, he might tell them, So there's that. Anyway, let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in from Nate Lee, who asks, in your opinion, with the arrows sticking out of Gandalf's hat, made the Peter Jackson Balrog scene look too goofy to hit the same way if he had put that in? It's a great line in the book, but maybe would be a bit distracting if shown in the movie. So I would honestly question your definition of goofy in this case. And I did get a comment from Nate, who stands by his feeling of what is goofy, and of course that's completely his prerogative. But maybe the image that you might have in your head is Steve Martin on Saturday Night Live with the prop that makes it look like there's an arrow going through his head. It's a funny image because of the comedic setting. Now, The Lord of the Rings is plenty of comedic moments. Merry razzing Frodo at Bag End. I love that part where Lobelia tells Frodo that he's not really a Baggins, he's half a Brandybuck. And Frodo says, "You hear that, Merry?" Because Merry's Brandybuck. You hear what she said? And Merry says, "It was a compliment, and therefore untrue," which is a great little burn there between friends. Sam draining the beer casks as they leave, that always cracks me up as well. Éomer roasting Grima Wormtongue as he flees from Mediceld is a really good one. There's a lot of funny moments there. And even, the Grima thing, that's kind of a serious moment, but Éomer snarks there. As the Fellowship are fleeing, arrows are raining down on them from the orcs, and they're quite lucky not to be struck. Well, Frodo actually does get struck by an arrow, but he's wearing the mithril shirt that protects him completely. I mean, he'd already gotten hit by a spear, much more serious. It smushed him a little bit. He was injured, but he did survive what otherwise would have been an absolute, mortal wound. An arrow coming so close to Gandalf's head as to pierce his hat isn't meant to be funny or goofy. It's meant to show how close he came to being killed right there, and the quest failing, because if Gandalf had been shot in the head, nobody could have stopped the Balrog from overtaking them. Now, Peter Jackson elected to have the orcs basically make themselves scarce as soon as the Balrog appeared, which was not a bad idea. It's basically the old filmmaking trope of the enemy forces scattering because something much worse has appeared. In this, the casual viewer who has perhaps not read The Lord of the Rings is made to immediately understand that the Balrog is quite a bit worse than an army of orcs. Thus, the constant hail of arrows ceased, and Gandalf didn't catch one in the hat. If I was in charge, if I was making a movie based on The Lord of the Rings, I would not have the arrow sticking out from his hat during the Balrog fight. Not because I think it looks goofy, but because I think that if an arrow shot his hat, the hat would just come off. Unless he was, against a wall, but then, I don't think he would have time to pry the hat down from the wall and get the arrow out of that. He's in a hurry here. I think he would abandon his hat at this point. A fabric hat, it's not going to stay on your head, even if it is shot by an arrow. Unless perhaps, Gandalf has some sort of magic keeping his hat on, but I don't think that's the case, So, of course, Gandalf has the hat in later scenes. Well, I don't think they specifically mentioned the hat. They mentioned the hat when he meets in the Two Towers, when he meets Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas in the woods, and then he tosses it aside and then he doesn't have it. But that's a different hat. That was, because he's Gandalf the White at this point. So I would say that, yeah, I wouldn't include the arrow sticking out. And I can see, based on your comment, if it's bobbing there while he's doing his speech, it might be distracting. Which, I don't know. Like I said, personally, to me, it mentions that the arrow hits his hat and sort of sticks there like a feather. It doesn't mention that it's still there during the Balrog confrontation. And I certainly think that it would have come off at some point. So I personally would not have chosen to have the arrow sticking. I would have shown the arrow hitting his head, or close to his head, his hat, because I think it's important to show just how dangerous this is, and to sort of do it differently from the previous films, to show that, yes, the orcs are still attacking and there's a Balrog. So it's sort of, like, oh, everything's bad at this point. But anyway, that's my thoughts on that. Let's move on to the... and by the way, in my original... I just wanted to include this because I think this is funny. In my original answer, when I wrote this on Quora, I called it a near miss. And then as soon as I wrote that, I thought of George Carlin speaking about how when two planes come very close to crashing into each other, they always call it a near miss. And George Carlin in his stand-up specials pointed out that doesn't make much sense. It's not a near miss. A near miss would be a hit. Oh, they nearly missed. So, yeah, that's just, I thought that was funny. I would bring that up because I think of the term near miss and how it really doesn't make sense from a linguistic standpoint. And Carlin was a linguist in his own sort of way. So, anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Nick Certeza, who asks, could the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings be levied or conscripted and trained by the Rangers of the North into a fighting force? How many could be mustered? What natural hobbit abilities would translate into which troop types and tactics? Could they be conscripted? No. Could they contribute to a war? Absolutely. The Rangers of the North had the Shire under their protection, which was a favor that their leader, Aragorn, was doing for his good friend Gandalf the Grey. Even before he was certain of it, Gandalf had suspected that the One Ring was in the Shire, and he wanted to make sure that no enemies were sniffing around. Unfortunately, there weren't enough Rangers to really go around, and Saruman still got in a few times, though as the Shire hobbits mistook him for Gandalf, it may be possible that the Ranger sentries also did, and he wasn't seen as an enemy at this point anyway, but although he wouldn't want to be seen. The Shire is large, as I mentioned earlier, and the Rangers were already kind of spread thin. The Nazgûl were able to enter the Shire by having some of them fight the Rangers and lure them away while others snuck in. The Rangers were not in charge of the Shire. They were there to protect it because Aragorn told them to, because Gandalf asked him to. Now, we could make the argument that as Aragorn is the chieftain of the Dunedain of the North, that essentially makes him the king of Arthedain, which is the land in which the Shire lays. However, his ancestors had abandoned the station of king of Arthedain due to the fall of the neighboring kingdoms of Rhudaur and Cardolan. And they were all part of the ancient kingdom of Arnor. Arnor got split into these three realms because of I wouldn't say a succession crisis, but a succession argument that could have turned into a civil war. Instead, they decided to split the realm into three. Now, Aragorn, of course, does have a claim to the kingship of Arnor, but the scepter of Arnor is actually held by Elrond, to be given to the king once he reunites Arnor and Gondor together. The Shire has its own government. It's led in ceremony by the mayor of Micheldilving, and in terms of military by the Thane. All this to say... I just actually, before I move on to that, so at the point at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, that would be the mayor of Micheldilving would be Will Whitfoot, and the Thane is Paladin Took. Now, so all this to say that Aragorn at the time, he didn't have the authority to conscript anybody in Aragorn, much less the self-governing land of the Shire. Even when he became the king, he was technically the king of the Shire, but he declared it a free land to be governed as they will. His only interference in the Shire being that he added land to their borders. The land of Westmarch became part of the Shire, and he enforced a ban on the big people from entering the Shire, which even he did not enter the Shire after that. He would send a letter to the mayor of Michel Delving, which at this point was Samwise, and he would say that he would like to meet him, and they would meet near the bridge at the border of the Shire, and they would go to the Prancing Pony in Bree, and they would hang out there. But he even though he could go in because he's the king, he stuck to his own law. Now, as pointed out by the likes of Bilbo and Gandalf, the Shire was not a stranger to war. They fought off an invasion of wargs one year when the water froze over and the wolves crossed the ice. They also stated that they contributed a battalion of archers to the war against Angmar. Though their role in that was not recorded by elves or by men, it was only the hobbits just sort of saying that they did this. Even one of Bilbo's ancestors, Bandabras Took, also called Bull Roarer, he fought goblins, and his beheading of a particularly large goblin named Gulfinbull with a club, sending the head into a gopher hole, was said to invent the game of golf. Yes, really. Of course, there would also be the later Battle of Bywater, and there were Hobbit casualties there, but they won over Saruman's ruffians. I would not say how many could be mustered. We do not know the numbers that were sent to Angmar, for example. But in the Battle of Bywater, we know that their casualties were only 19 hobbits were killed. Pippin was said to bring 100 tooks as a sort of a rallying force, and we know that only 2 of those died. But we don't know how many hobbits were in total taking part in this battle. Though the forces sent to Angmar were said to be archers, the Battle of Bywater had melee fighters as well. Merry killed the ruffian leader with a sword, and many of the ruffians died to hobbits that were using axes. Now, these weren't like battle axes. They were tools. They were made for chopping trees and stuff like that. But of course, you could use a tool as a weapon. A lot of historical weapons started as tools, and when that's what you have and you're protecting your land, that's what you use. So Pippin was able to easily, and I would say rather quickly, raise a force of 100, and this is just from one part of the Shire. It's just his family. It was Tooks. It wasn't even people from Tookborough. It was Tooks. So definitely a lot more than 100 could go to war if they needed to. Of course, it was a lot easier to muster forces to defend their own land than it would be to invade another land or to come to aid to another land. But I think it would be a surprisingly large force if it came down to it. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Okay, our next question comes in from Nate Lee, and I really like this question. He asks, does Aragorn have specific knowledge of what would happen to Gandalf in Moria? He warns him directly, and even says his warning is not for concern of the others, but for Gandalf to beware. Perhaps a vision he saw in Galadriel's mirror long ago. Good catch. Let's examine what Aragorn actually said in this scene. Let's have a look at the quote. I'm going to read you this part. I too once passed the Dimril gate, said Aragorn quietly. But though I also came out again, the memory is very evil. I do not wish to enter Moria a second time. And I don't wish to enter it even once, said Pippin. Nor me, muttered Sam. Of course not, said Gandalf. Who would? But the question is, who will follow me if I lead you there? I will, said Gimli eagerly. I will, said Aragorn heavily. You followed my lead almost to disaster in the snow, and have said no word of blame. I will follow your lead now, if this last warning does not move you. It is not of the ring, nor of us others that I am thinking now, but of you, Gandalf. And I say to you, if you pass the doors of Moria, beware. So, in this scene, Gandalf is sort of pulling the idea of going into Moria. Aragorn's against it, Legolas is against it, Boromir is against it. Boromir is really against it. And Gimli is sort of the only one that's willing to go, which encourages Gandalf, as he feels that Gimli may be able to navigate underground better than he has. Although Gimli's never been inside Moria as a dwarf, he would be more naturally inclined to not get lost in these sort of caverns and tunnels. Aragorn has been to Moria before, and he wasn't a big fan. 0 stars. He left a bad review on Yelp. However, it is curious that he says it is not the rest of the party, or even the One Ring, and by extension Frodo, that he's thinking of, but rather specifically Gandalf. This doesn't get talked about enough. That's why I like this question. I think, as the questioner suggested, Aragorn had indeed spent some time in Lothlorien in the past, and he may have indeed seen a possible future in the Mirror of Galadriel, but I don't think that's the case. If that was the case, I would think that Aragorn would have known a lot more than he did, such as the fact that he would have had any reason to be traveling with such a company at all. I think Aragorn has just been struck with a sudden foreboding, a foresight that Moria may speak ill for Gandalf in particular, and I believe this is possible to happen to anyone. This sort of thing certainly happens to Frodo at a few points, for example, but Aragorn's heritage makes him somewhat sensitive to this sort of thing. The origin of the Mirror of Galadriel is unknown, but Galadriel once spent quite a bit of time in Doriath, and she learned a lot of tricks from the Queen of Doriath, Melian. And Melian's not an elf, she's one of the Ainur, she's an angel. Melian had powers far greater than the elves, and she was known for her great foresight. The power that Galadriel uses via her Ring of Power, Nenya, is somewhat a crude version of the girdle of Melian that protected Doriath, for example. That being said, Aragorn is a direct descendant of Melian. Thingol and Melian had a daughter named Luthien, and of course Luthien wed Beren, and their son was named Dior. And Dior had 3 children with his wife Nimloth, but the important one was his daughter Elwing. And Elwing married Eärendil, and they had 2 sons, Elrond and Elros. And Elros, as the first king of Númenor, is Aragorn's direct ancestor about 60 generations back. That being said, with Aragorn's unique nature as being a descendant of such lofty characters, one of them an angel, and also with the lines of his ancestors Isildur and Anarion being reconverged at one point through the marriage of Edwy, he may have a natural affinity for foresight, though it may be undisciplined and come off as a sort of just a bad feeling. And it's all quickly swept aside because Frodo suggests, well, why don't we sleep on it before we vote on this? And then they quickly realize that the howling wind that they're hearing is not howling wind, it's howling wolves, the wargs, and they quickly and unanimously decide to flee to Moria, as the danger that they don't know may be lesser than the one that they do, which of course turns out not to be true, but this is the way it had to happen. Of course, if they didn't go into Moria, worse things would have happened. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Riley37, who asks one of the sorts of questions that on its face seems sort of silly. It seems like this is a ridiculous question, but there's actually a lot to talk about with this one. When Ugluk was an infant raised at Isengard, assuming his mother sang lullabies to him, and considering everything which Tolkien established about the languages of Middle-earth, what was the language of those lullabies? So it seems silly, but it's a roundabout way of asking what language they spoke. Tolkien never commented on family structure or the domestic culture of goblins. I think thinking about that sort of thing made him uncomfortable. As an Uruk-hai, Ugluk has both goblin and mannish ancestry. Saruman created the Uruk-hai by breeding goblins and men together. Some of the results of this are called half-orcs, which are closer to being men, but when you look close at them, they have some goblin traits. We see some of these in Bree and later in the Shire, agents of Saruman in both cases. Some of the results, though, are Uruk-hai, which literally means goblin men, which are more like goblins with mannish traits, such as being tall, as men are, and being able to travel in the daytime with no issues. Both of these were useful to Saruman, as the Uruk-hai were a vicious, though undisciplined fighting force that did not need to rest during the day or hide from the sun, while his half-orcs made great spies. What's important to realize, though, is that the likes of Ugluk are likely not first generation. Saruman had been at this for quite a while. Here is a list of things that Tolkien never commented on. The lifespan of goblins, goblin stages of life, such as how long they're children, when they're considered to be adults, etc., how introducing mannish blood into their lines would affect the previous two entries, and how many generations it took for Saruman to perfect the Uruk-hai. That being said, while the likes of Ugluk would have mannish ancestors in recent memory, his mother may have either just been an orc or an Uruk-hai woman, Saruman did not create these guys to have much of a culture. They loved him because he let them eat people, and generally he treated them okay, at least better than Sauron was known to treat his foot soldiers. Note the arguments that happen in the Two Towers between the Isengard or Uruk-hai and the Mordor Uruks. The Mordor guys are afraid of Sauron, and they follow his orders because it's or else. But the Uruk-hai have a sort of a pride in following Saruman and who they are. And even they came up with the nickname Sharku, which means old man for him, which he misheard as Sharky. Saruman describes Sharky as a term of affection, which makes it seem likely to me that the Uruk-hai saw Saruman as their father figure. Whether or not they had mother figures, that's up for debate, of course. I don't think they had lullabies. Tolkien came to dislike the idea that he had created an always evil race, and he struggled with the nature of the goblins. But in the case of the Isengard Uruk-hai, their lullaby was probably Saruman's own seeming fair words. We don't get a lot of impressions that they spoke the various Orcish dialects prevalent amongst their people, nor the black speech that Sauron had devised, as Merry and Pippin are able to understand them fully when they talk to each other, and it's never mentioned that they spoke in a way that the hobbits could not understand. Of course, Sharku is Orcish, and they knew at least, some of an Orcish dialect, but they didn't seem to generally speak it very much. The bits of Orcish that the Uruk-hai knew were probably filtered down from their more pure goblin ancestors. The reason that Saruman would favor Westron is likely because everyone in Middle-earth speaks Westron. It's the common speech. So when you meet somebody of a different culture that had a different language, you could fall back on Westron because it was always understood. Now, Frodo was able to understand the orcs when he's in Mordor. This is because of the One Ring. It let Bilbo, for example, understand the spiders in Mirkwood, though they also knew Westron because they were able to understand and be offended by the things that Bilbo was saying to them. In arguing over whether to deliver these prisoners, or over where to deliver these prisoners, I should say, whether to deliver them to Saruman or to bring them to Sauron, these guys actually had a good reason to speak in a language that Merry and Pippin would not be able to understand, but they spoke Westron. This, on the part of the Isengarders, may have been due to being more comfortable with Westron, only knowing snatches of Orcish, or it could be that the Mordor Uruks had a different dialect and they may not have been easily understood. So what I'm saying is I don't think they had lullabies. I kind of doubt that. But as far as they had any language that they would speak amongst themselves, I think they spoke Westron because sort of everybody speaks Westron, and that's likely the language that Saruman would have taught them. And now let's move on to the last question. So our last question comes in from Scratchcot, who asks, who was left in command of Nargothrond while most of its army went to fight the incoming force before the fall, since we know there were some armed force there and we know some of them actually escaped? Good question. Tolkien doesn't specify who was in charge of the forces at Nargothrond as Túrin and Orodreth went off to battle Glaurung's forces, but we can make a very educated guess, and I'm going to say that I'm probably right about this. But I'm going to back it up. The Silmarillion itself offers no hint as to who exactly was left behind in Nargothrond to command its small force there, as well as look after the civilian population. We know that both Túrin and Orodreth went off to sortie with Glaurung, and it didn't go well. Orodreth was slain. Glaurung's forces pushed forward and sacked Nargothrond, ending the civilization, though we know at least some elves escaped and fled elsewhere. Túrin had the option to return to Nargothrond and try to rescue Orodreth's daughter Finduilis, who he was in love. Well, she was in love with him. I think he loved her though, but he believed the lies of the dragon Glaurung, who assured him that if he did this, he would never see his sister again. So he chose his sister, and he went to Hithlum to search for her, abandoning Finduilis to a rather grisly fate, and seemingly ending the line of Orodreth with the death of his only child, at least according to the Silmarillion. The Children of Húrin does nothing to clarify the manner of who was in charge at home, nor to contradict the end of Orodreth's line. However, the book The Peoples of Middle-earth gives us an answer that certainly answers the latter and possibly answers the former, and that is Iranian Gil-galad. In the Silmarillion, it is explicitly mentioned that Gil-galad was a son of Fingon, which Christopher Tolkien later said was an error of editing. The Silmarillion was never completed by Tolkien. The published version is cobbled together from various drafts to a somewhat complete state. Due to having to choose from multiple versions of every little bit of it, Christopher had to make some hard choices in editing the work, and of course it was not perfect. At an early point, Gil-galad was meant to be the son of Fingon, but Tolkien later changed his mind, as this would create sort of a succession crisis. If Gil-galad was Fingon's son, he would be the High King of the Noldor before Turgon, not after him. And the published The Lord of the Rings established that Gil-galad was the last High King, and that Turgon was High King before him. Christopher was aware that his father changed his mind, but was uncomfortable with actually rewriting any part of his father's work. Tolkien had noted that the revised parentage should be that Gil-galad was Orodreth's son, who escaped from the sack of Nargothrond, thus explaining why he was High King after Turgon, and leaving Fingon without children, explaining why his first cousin, once removed, would succeed him. In the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, Christopher explains that he felt his decision to not include Gil-galad's true parentage in the Silmarillion was a mistake on his part, and included his father's notes that stated that Gil-galad's revised parentage, along with the information that he had fled from the sack of Nargothrond. So as Gil-galad specifically fled the sack of Nargothrond, we know that he was not in battle with his father and with Túrin, and he was at home with his sister Finduilis. It's just that she got captured and later killed, and he escaped. As he was Orodreth's son, it seems to be reasonable to assume that it was Gil-galad who was in charge of Nargothrond while his father was away. Anyway, I had a blast, and I didn't think I would, and I say this a lot, but I had a terrible, terrible migraine earlier, and then I had to stream, and I was sort of like feeling almost like I wanted to cancel, but then I really didn't want to cancel. And sometimes the act of streaming and the act of speaking into a microphone and can actually help my migraines, and it did in this case. And I did take a little bit of a break before doing this, but then, we got through it, and I had a blast. So thank you guys for 2,000 subscribers. That is absolutely huge. I guess we're on the push to 3,000, right? I don't know what we'll do at 3,000, but at 2,000, as of next month, because I have to get a few things together, I have to buy some things and get moderation going and such. We're going to start streaming here on YouTube as well as on Twitch. So I think it's going to be exciting, because a few people have said that they don't really prefer to use Twitch, which is absolutely fine, because all those they call them VODs, video on demands, they wind up here on YouTube later on. And of course now they will also be live on YouTube starting next month. So that's exciting for me. So if you've reached the end of the video and you're not a subscriber, I think you should subscribe at this point, because we're going to push for 3,000, and because you've reached the end of like an hour-long video. So you must enjoy it, and I'm sure you want to see more of it. So make sure that you not only subscribe by hitting the subscribe button, but also hit the bell, turn on notifications, make sure all that is there and in place. And if you're watching this video and you're already subscribed, just make sure that you're still subscribed, because sometimes subscriptions get removed randomly for no particular reason. You may think that you're subscribed and you're not, so just see whether or not that's clicked It should say subscribed. If it doesn't say that, you'll have to do it again, I guess. It's happened before. I haven't got any reports of it happened specifically on this channel, but it has happened to me with my other channel and such. So anyway, if you want to support me on a different level, consider membership. Members get to see all of the videos at least a week early, sometimes more than a week early. And you get some emotes, and especially considering that we're going to have live streams here on YouTube real soon, you'll get to use those emotes in chats. There's a One Ring, there's a Silmaril, there's an Eye of Sauron, and there's another one. I forget what it actually is. And we're going to create some more because we've opened up more slots, and we're going to have live streams. So I'm going to create some more emotes for you guys as well. So anyway, we'll see you guys next time.